To give you an idea of Romanesque architecture in Italy, we have to look at this little piece of Pisa, almost a slice of what might be Romanesque. And I'll stop with the cheesy puns at some point. Pisa itself is a prosperous maritime city. We see the spoils of naval victory over the Muslims providing funds that would be funneled into this cathedral complex. And this is a rare example of all three structures in an Italian cathedral complex being built at a similar time and therefore in a similar style. The Italian style is to separate these three structures. So you would have the baptistry separate from the church. The reason is you couldn't actually go into a church if you weren't Christian, and you need to be baptized to get into the church, so why not make the baptistry separate? And then the bell tower, they see as a separate form, whereas in the rest of Europe, in Northern Europe, that's typically up on that front facade on the west side of the building or the westworks. So as we step into this wonderful piece of Pisa, yeah, I'm just going to keep doing it, we have to deal with the cathedral. And this is a massive cathedral for the time. You can get a sense of scale from the tourists walking around it. It has a timber roof and an arcade surrounding it with these engaged columns, giving this sense of a false arcade. Same thing on the facade, although there they are not engaged. You can't actually walk up there, but it does give that appearance. Arcades, of course, being a very common form in ancient Rome for covered walkways. And so they're mimicking that style. We can clearly see a clerestory being used in the structure, again, borrowing from the Romans. And we have broad projecting transepts with these radiating chapels on either end. And then we have a dome in the center over the crossing. Again, that idea of sort of taking your prayers closer to the heavens. If we move inside, we will see that just like with the Romans, the structure is covered in rich marble. Now, this is a revetment. This is a veneer over what is basically a brick structure that is later covered over to make it look much more impressive than it really is. And we see a series of murals, both in the Byzantine form, but then we see some Renaissance pieces. For example, up here in the corners, these are obviously Renaissance frescoes, whereas this is a very Byzantine Christ in Majesty. And then we have Renaissance paintings and a very famous pulpit that we deal with in the Proto-Renaissance in the second half of this class when we look at Renaissance to modern. The bell tower is very, very famous, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And had they built it out of something that wasn't basically crust, sauce, and cheese, it probably would stand up okay. Okay, leaving that aside, what we see is a series of arcades, really repeating the structure, the facade of the cathedral. And it began leaning during construction. The problem with it is they happened to put it on what used to be the ancient bank of a river, of the River Arno that flows through Pisa and today is about half a mile away. But of course, rivers meander and move, as we know from geography. And so half of it is on silty soil, which would be the bottom of the river, and half of it is on clay soil, thus allowing it to tip. And it began leaning actually during construction. By the late 90s, it was leaning quite a bit, and there was a lot of concern that it would eventually collapse. In 1999, they began removing soil on the north side to try and bring it back to vertical. It was also at the time cabled to a building. In fact, when I was there, it was cabled to another structure some distance, some hundreds of yards away. So what did it do? It basically brought it back about an inch closer to vertical, but in the process, it ensured increased stability for at least another 300 years. It also meant that they could open up this tower again. It had been closed for some time, allowing for tourists to actually climb up into the structure. It's also famous as a place where Galileo dropped things off of it to prove some of his theories, because of course it's a beautiful free drop on that side where it leans off, because if I want to drop something, say a feather and a lead weight, I can do so or a cannonball, I can do so off this side, and it just free falls to the ground. Sort of a rare place where you can find that in Italy at the time of Galileo. Very, very important structure. And it was originally meant as the bell tower. So it would act as the alarm for the city, but also call people to prayer, let them know what time it is. It would be central to really Romanesque and eventually sort of this late medieval and Renaissance Pisa, and actually was in continuous use for a long time, well into the 19th century, before people really got concerned about stability, and it fell out of use for a period of time before being restored, and as I said, brought back a little bit closer to vertical. But we know that you don't want something perfectly square, because round pizzas are better than square pizzas because it allows you to cut a slant in it. And of course, okay, I'll stop with the puns and the pizza talk. But hopefully this little slice of Pisa has brought you some appreciation for what we find in the area and this Romanesque architecture that we see throughout Italy.